Chapter 1. The Devil's Road, May 23, 1934. A rural highway near Gibbsland, Louisiana. The air is thick and wet, heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. Dawn has not yet broken, but a pale, milky light begins to seep through the dense canopy of trees, illuminating a fog that clings to the gravel road like a shroud. The world is quiet, save for the hum of insects and the distant call of a waking bird. It is a morning like any other in the deep south, peaceful and serene. But on this road, on this morning, 6 men are hiding in the bushes, and they are not here for the sunrise. They are here to deliver death. Their hands are slick with sweat, their knuckles white as they grip their weapons. They have been waiting for hours, their bodies stiff, their nerves stretched to a breaking point. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sends a jolt through them. They are a posse of lawmen, a mix of Texas Rangers and Louisiana deputies, and they are hunting the most famous and feared outlaws in America. Their leader is a man who seems carved from granite, a living legend of Texas law enforcement named Frank Hamer. Hamer is 50 years old, his face a roadmap of hard-won battles, his eyes holding a cold, steady calm that unnerves even the men by his side. He has been on this trail for 102 days, a relentless, methodical pursuit across the heartland. He has studied his prey, learned their habits, their patterns, their dependencies. He knows they are creatures of habit, drawn back to family like moths to a flame. And he knows that this road, this specific stretch of forgotten highway, is where their journey will end. The plan is simple. It is brutal. There will be no warnings, no calls to surrender. The time for that has long passed. Too many officers lie dead. Too many families shattered. The orders are understood without being spoken. When the car appears, it is to be annihilated. Among the men is Ted Hinton, a Dallas County deputy, who knew one of the fugitives personally. He remembers her from her days as a waitress at Marco's Cafe in Dallas. He remembers a pretty, bright-eyed girl with a quick wit. It feels like a lifetime ago. Now he holds a Browning automatic rifle, a weapon of war, and waits to extinguish that life. The tension is unbearable. The sun climbs higher, burning off the fog, and the heat begins to build. The men shift their weight, their clothes sticking to their skin. Doubts begin to creep in. Did they get the wrong information? Did the targets change their route? Hammer remains motionless, a statue of deadly patience. He knows. He is certain. And then, they hear it. A faint, distant rumble, growing steadily louder. It's the distinct sound of a Ford V8 engine, pushed hard. The sound that has become synonymous with their quarry. It is the sound of approaching doom. The men crouch lower, their breathing shallow. Hammer raises a hand, a silent command. Every muscle in their bodies tenses. The car, a dusty Ford Deluxe sedan, comes into view, moving fast down the long, straight road. It kicks up a plume of reddish dust. Inside that car are Clyde Chestnut Barrow and Bonnie Elizabeth Parker. They are 25 and 23 years old. To the American public, they are phantoms, romantic rebels, Depression-era Robin Hoods. To the lawmen hiding in the trees, they are rabid dogs that must be put down. The car draws closer, 100 yards, 50. The faces inside are now visible. Itchrekshras and Fick. Clyde is driving, a cigarillo clamped between his teeth, his foot heavy on the accelerator. Bonnie is in the passenger seat, eating a sandwich. They seem relaxed, unaware. They are heading into a perfectly laid trap, a storm of lead and steel from which there will be no escape. The world seems to slow down. The hum of the engine, the chirping of the birds, the frantic beating of hearts in the brush, it all converges on this single, irreversible moment. The story of Bonnie and Clyde is not one of romance. It is a story of poverty, violence, and delusion, born from the dust and despair of the Great Depression. And here on this lonely Louisiana road, the final bloody chapter is about to be written. The worst was yet to come. Chapter 2. Children of the Dust. To understand the bloody end on that Louisiana road, one must first understand the beginning, a beginning rooted not in glamour, but in grime. We must go back to the slums of West Dallas, Texas, a place in the early 20th century known as the Devil's Back Porch. It was a landscape of raw desperation, a sprawling, unincorporated wasteland of unpaved streets, shotgun shacks, and crushing poverty, sitting in the shadow of the city's gleaming new skyscrapers. Here, families lived in tents and makeshift homes without running water or electricity, their lives dictated by the whims of the nearby Trinity River, which regularly flooded their meager existence, and the belching smokestacks of the Trinity Portland Cement Company, which coated everything and everyone in a fine gray dust. This was Cement City, the world that forged Clyde Chestnut Barrow, born March 24, 1909 in Tellico, Texas. Clyde was the fifth of 7 children born to Henry and Cumie Barrow, tenant farmers trapped in a cycle of debt and failure. When their farm failed for the last time, they, like so many others, packed their belongings into a rickety wagon and sought a better life in Dallas. They found only the squalor of the West Dallas encampment, living for a time under their wagon until they could scrape together enough to build a shack. Clyde was a small, almost frail boy, overshadowed by his older, more charismatic brother, Marvin, known to everyone as Buck. He was quiet, sensitive, and desperate for an identity beyond the poverty that defined him. He was ashamed of his family's circumstances, of the hand-me-down clothes, of the constant struggle. School held no interest for him. It was a place of humiliation, where his lack of proper shoes and clean clothes made him a target. His real education took place on the streets. For a boy like Clyde in West Dallas, the path to respect, to being someone, was not through hard work. There was no work to be had, but through crime. It started small, stealing chickens, then turkeys. He learned to pick locks, to siphon gasoline. He discovered a natural talent for stealing cars, a skill that gave him a sense of power and freedom he had never known. The automobile, that symbol of American progress and prosperity, became for Clyde a tool of rebellion, his escape vehicle from a life he despised. He dreamed of being a musician, learning to play the guitar and saxophone. But the lure of the outlaw life, glamorized in the pulp magazines and silent films of the day, was stronger. He idolized figures like Jesse James, not as a killer, but as a man who took what he wanted, a man who refused to be broken by the system. He wasn't inherently evil, not yet. He was a product of his environment, a boy searching for a shortcut out of the dust. Miles away, in the small town of Rowena, Texas, another child of the Depression was dreaming of a different kind of escape. Bonnie Elizabeth Parker, born October 1, 1910, was a world away from Clyde Barrow in temperament and aspiration. Her father, a bricklayer, died when she was just 4, forcing her mother, Emma, to move Bonnie and her 2 siblings to Cement City to live with her parents. Despite the same impoverished surroundings, Bonnie excelled. She was a bright, precocious child, a star student who won spelling bees and loved to write poetry. She was a performer, captivating friends and family with her flair for the dramatic. She dreamed of the stage, of Broadway, of seeing her name in lights. She was pretty, with strawberry blonde hair and expressive eyes, and she knew it. But for a girl in her position, dreams were a luxury. Reality was a ticking clock, and the most common escape route was marriage. At the tender age of 15, just before her 16th birthday, she dropped out of school to marry a local boy named Roy Thornton. It was a disastrous mistake. Thornton was a handsome but shiftless drifter, and the marriage quickly soured into neglect and abuse. He was frequently absent, and when he was around, he was often in trouble with the law. In 1929, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison for robbery. Bonnie was left alone at 19. A married woman with an absentee convict husband working a dead-end job as a waitress at Marco's Cafe in Dallas. The Great Depression had now descended upon the nation, choking off what little hope remained. The stock market crash of 1929 had sent a shockwave across the country, and places like West Dallas were hit the hardest. Banks failed, businesses closed, and the breadlines grew longer. The American dream had become a waking nightmare. For millions, the system had failed. There was a growing resentment toward the banks that foreclosed on farms, the politicians who seemed powerless, and the law that appeared to protect the rich while punishing the poor. It was in this climate of widespread disillusionment and economic collapse that the age of the public enemy was born. Outlaws like John Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd, and Babyface Nelson became folk heroes to some, their brazen bank robberies seen as a form of populist rebellion. They were striking back at the very institutions that people blamed for their suffering. It was into this world, a world of shattered dreams and simmering anger, that Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow were about to collide. She was a poet without a stage, a romantic trapped in a sordid reality. He was an aspiring bad man looking for an audience. In January of 1930, at the home of a mutual friend, their eyes met for the first time. Clyde was 20, Bonnie was 19. She was captivated by his confidence, his dark wavy hair and his quiet intensity. He was smitten with her beauty and her fiery spirit. He told her of his ambitions, not of music, but of a life of crime that would make him famous. She listened, not with fear, but with fascination. In Clyde Barrow, Bonnie Parker saw not a criminal but a ticket out, a chance for the adventure and excitement she craved, a story more thrilling than any movie she had ever seen. Their connection was instant, and it was absolute. But this was no fairy tale. Their meeting was not the beginning of a great romance, but the lighting of a fuse on a stick of dynamite. A fuse that would burn for 4 violent years, leaving a trail of blood and wreckage across the American heartland, before finally, inevitably, exploding on a lonely road in Louisiana. Chapter 3. The Gates of Hell. The intoxicating thrill of their first meeting was short-lived. Just weeks after Bonnie and Clyde fell for each other in that small Dallas house, the law caught up with Clyde for a string of burglaries and car thefts. He was arrested and thrown into the Waco City Jail. The separation was agonizing for Bonnie. She visited him daily, her devotion absolute. It was during these visits, through the thick jailhouse screen, that a fateful plan was hatched. Clyde, desperate to avoid a long prison sentence, convinced Bonnie to help him escape. For a girl who had always followed the rules, who had written poems and dreamed of a respectable life, this was the ultimate transgression. It was the moment she had to choose between the world she knew and the world Clyde offered. She chose Clyde. On March 11, 1930, Bonnie Parker smuggled a .32 caliber Colt pistol to Clyde during one of her visits. The gun was likely taped to her thigh, hidden beneath her dress. It was a shockingly audacious act, the first crime of her life. That night, Clyde and two other inmates used the weapon to force their way out of the jail. Their freedom, however, was fleeting. They were captured a week later in Ohio after a bungled robbery. This time, there would be no leniency. Clyde was sentenced to 14 years in the Texas state penitentiary system. The sentence was a death knell, but the place he was sent to was worse than any prison. It was Eastham Prison Farm. Known simply as the Ham, Eastham was not a place of rehabilitation. It was a place of systematic torture and brutalization, a remnant of the old plantation system hidden deep in the East Texas woods. Prisoners were forced into back-breaking labor in the cotton fields from sunup to sundown, under the watchful eyes of armed guards on horseback. The heat was suffocating. The food was barely edible, and the punishment for any infraction was swift and savage. Inmates were whipped with a leather strap, known as the bat, beaten by guards, and terrorized by a system of inmate trustees, or building tenders, who enforced discipline through violence and fear. For a small, slight man like Clyde Barrow, Eastham was a living hell. He was repeatedly and brutally sexually assaulted by a larger, predatory inmate. He wrote desperate letters to Bonnie, letters filled with a growing sense of despair and a hardening rage. He pleaded for parole, promising to go straight, but his pleas were ignored. The system was designed to break men, and it was breaking him. He arrived at Eastham a petty thief. The experience was forging him into something else entirely, something cold and full of hate. He became obsessed with two things: escape and revenge. He wanted to inflict upon the world, and specifically the Texas Department of Corrections, the same kind of pain and humiliation he was enduring. In late 1931, in a desperate bid to be transferred out of the unbearable conditions of the field labor, Clyde made a horrifying decision. He had another inmate take an axe and chop off 2 of his toes. The self-mutilation was a calculated act of desperation, a gamble to get sent to the main prison hospital in Huntsville. Ironically, just 6 days after he crippled himself for life, his mother's persistent lobbying paid off. Unaware of his injury, the governor signed his parole papers. In February of 1932, Clyde Barrow limped out of the gates of Eastham a free man. But the man who walked out was not the same one who had walked in 2 years earlier. The boyish insecurity was gone, replaced by a permanent icy resolve. His face was harder, his eyes colder. The experience had hollowed him out and filled the void with a venomous hatred for the law and the system that had brutalized him. He would later tell his family that he would die before he ever went back to a place like that. He meant it. He reunited with Bonnie, but their dreams of a quiet life, of maybe moving away and starting fresh, were a fantasy. Clyde had no intention of working a legitimate job for paltry wages. The world owed him, and he was going to take what he felt was his. He quickly assembled a small crew, including a young man named Ralph Fultz, and began a series of small-time robberies. They hit grocery stores and gas stations, their hauls often amounting to no more than a few dollars. These were not the master criminals of legend. They were clumsy, disorganized, and increasingly reckless. Their crimes were about sustenance, and for Clyde about a growing addiction to the thrill. Bonnie did not participate in these early robberies. She remained on the sidelines, a worried accomplice waiting for Clyde in the getaway car. Her family pleaded with her to leave him, to save herself before it was too late. But she was bound to him by love and by a shared sense of being outsiders against the world. The turning point, the moment the line was crossed from theft to murder, came on April 30th, 1932 in Hillsboro, Texas. During a botched robbery of a general store, the owner, John Butcher, reached for a weapon. Clyde's partner panicked and opened fire. Butcher was killed. Though Clyde may not have pulled the trigger, he was there. He was now a party to murder. The stakes had been raised irrevocably. Just a few months later, in August, while Bonnie waited in the car, Clyde and another associate were drinking at a string dance in Oklahoma when they were approached by Sheriff C.G. Maxwell and his deputy Eugene Moore. A shootout erupted. Deputy Moore was shot and killed. Clyde Barrow was now a wanted cop killer. The law was no longer just pursuing him for robbery. They were hunting him. The names Bonnie and Clyde began to appear in newspapers across Texas and Oklahoma. They were no longer anonymous figures from the Dallas slums. They were becoming known. But with that recognition came a new, terrifying reality. They were on the run, constantly moving, sleeping in their stolen cars on the side of desolate roads, eating cold canned food. The initial excitement was curdling into a state of perpetual fear and paranoia. Every approaching headlight, every stranger's glance could be the end. This was not the glamorous life Bonnie had imagined. It was a dirty, exhausting, and lonely existence. In the spring of 1933, they would be joined by Clyde's newly paroled brother, Buck, and his wife, Blanche. The gang would be whole for a time, but their reunion would only accelerate their descent, leading to a confrontation that would transform them from regional nuisances into national celebrities, and in doing so, sign their death warrants. Chapter 4. The Barrow Gang. In the spring of 1933, the core of what the newspapers would dub the Barrow Gang was finally assembled. Clyde's older brother, Marvin Buck Barrow, had been granted a full pardon from the Texas State Penitentiary, largely due to the tireless campaigning of his wife, Blanche. Buck was everything Clyde was not: gregarious, loud, and generally good-natured. He had a history of petty crime, but he lacked Clyde's cold-blooded resolve. His motivation for rejoining his younger brother was a complex mix of familial loyalty, a misguided sense of adventure, and the simple fact that as an ex-convict in the Depression, legitimate opportunities were non-existent. He loved his little brother, and Clyde, in turn, idolized him. Their reunion was a joyous one, a brief return to the familiar bonds of brotherhood amidst the chaos of their fugitive lives. But Buck's arrival brought with it a fourth, and perhaps most reluctant, member, his wife, Blanche Caldwell Barrow. Blanche was a preacher's daughter, a woman who craved respectability and a stable home. She was deeply religious and terrified of the criminal world her husband was being drawn back into. She loved Buck fiercely, but she despised Clyde, whom she blamed for leading her husband astray. She was a woman caught in an impossible situation, forced to choose between her safety and her marriage. Her diary, later recovered by police, provides an invaluable intimate glimpse into the daily life of the gang. A life dominated not by excitement, but by constant, gnawing fear. She wrote of the endless driving, the bickering, the poor food, and the ever-present threat of capture. She described Bonnie as a gun moll, a term of derision, and detailed the friction between the two women, forced into an unwanted intimacy in the cramped confines of stolen automobiles. While Bonnie embraced the outlaw persona, posing for photographs with cigars and pistols, Blanche recoiled from it, seeing only the grim reality of their situation. The fifth member of this volatile group was a young teenager named William Daniel Jones, better known as W.D. Jones. A childhood friend of the Barrows from West Dallas, Jones was impressionable and eager to escape his own life of poverty. He looked up to Clyde as a hero and was easily drawn into the gang's orbit. He was in many ways the gang's disposable utility man, a driver, a lookout, a gopher, but he was also a witness, and his later testimony would provide some of the most chilling and detailed accounts of the gang's inner workings and their capacity for violence. He described Clyde as a man who had become increasingly quick to kill, particularly when cornered. He recalled a conversation where Clyde stated, "I ain't going to get caught. When they come after me, I'm going to kill them." It was a promise he would keep. The dynamic within this small group was a pressure cooker of conflicting desires and personalities. Clyde was the undisputed leader, his decisions absolute. He was a master driver and a skilled mechanic, able to keep their stolen Ford V8s running at peak performance, often modifying them for greater speed. He was also the chief strategist, meticulously planning their routes to take advantage of state lines, which at the time created jurisdictional nightmares for law enforcement. A crime committed in Texas could not be pursued by Texas officers once the fugitives crossed into Oklahoma or Louisiana. This legal loophole, combined with the lack of centralized police communication, was the gang's greatest asset. Bonnie was Clyde's partner in every sense. Her loyalty was his anchor. She was the lookout, the loader of weapons during pursuits, and the gang's morale officer. Her presence softened Clyde's rough edges, and gave their violent spree a veneer of tragic romance in the eyes of the public. Buck provided a sense of normalcy, a link to the family life they had all left behind. while Blanche served as a constant nervous reminder of the world of law and morality they had abandoned. Jones was the apprentice, learning the trade of the outlaw at the feet of a man who was becoming a master of it. On the other side of the law, a different kind of gang was forming. The Barrow gang's escalating crimes, now spanning multiple states, were beginning to attract serious attention. In Dallas, Sheriff Richard Smoot Schmid and his chief criminal deputy Bob Alcorn were methodically piecing together the gang's movements. They were frustrated by the jurisdictional limits that hampered their pursuit, but they were determined. They began to coordinate with law enforcement agencies in Oklahoma, Arkansas, Missouri, and Louisiana, creating an informal network dedicated to the gang's capture. These were not the bumbling Keystone Cops of legend. They were dedicated, often underpaid, and increasingly angry officers who were tired of seeing their colleagues gunned down. They faced a formidable challenge. The gang was a moving target, armed with superior firepower, particularly the Browning automatic rifle, or BAR, which Clyde had stolen from a National Guard armory. This weapon could fire hundreds of rounds a minute, easily piercing the thin steel of police cars of the era. The lawmen were often outgunned, driving slower vehicles, and forced to stop at the state line while their quarry sped away. But they had one advantage: they were relentless, and they were learning. They studied the gang's patterns, noting their tendency to drive long distances, camp out in remote areas, and then double back to Dallas to see their families. The family connection, Clyde's greatest emotional need, was also his greatest tactical weakness. It was this weakness that the law would eventually exploit with brutal efficiency. The stage was set for a collision. On one side, a desperate family of outlaws, armed to the teeth and bound by a code of loyalty and survival. On the other, a growing coalition of lawmen fueled by grief and a determination to end the reign of terror. In April of 1933, the two sides would meet in the quiet, unsuspecting town of Joplin, Missouri. The confrontation would be a disaster for law enforcement, but in their hasty retreat, the Barrow gang would make a single catastrophic mistake. They would leave behind a roll of film that would change everything, transforming them from faceless criminals into American icons, and turning their pursuers from hunters into executioners. Chapter 5. The Devil's Camera. In early April of 1933, the Barrow gang needed a place to lie low. They had been on a spree of small-time robberies through Missouri and were looking for a quiet refuge to rest and regroup. They chose Joplin, a sleepy mining town, where they believed they could blend in. On April 13th, they rented a second-story apartment above a garage. To the neighbors, they were just a group of young people on a long vacation. They played cards, drank, and listened to the radio. Buck and W.D. Jones were loud and boisterous, their laughter echoing through the neighborhood. Clyde, ever cautious, would have preferred more discretion, but he relented. The decision to stay in a residential area, a decision born of exhaustion and a desire for a semblance of normal life, was a critical error. Their loud, late-night card games soon drew the suspicion of their neighbors, who reported the group to the Joplin Police Department. The police, suspecting bootleggers, assembled a small 5-man posse to investigate. They believed they were preparing for a routine raid on a local speakeasy. They had no idea they were about to walk into a hornet's nest. The officers planned a surprise raid. 2 men blocked the driveway while 3 others approached the apartment. As they neared the garage, a figure, likely Clyde, opened fire from an upstairs window with a Browning automatic rifle. The effect was devastating. The high-powered rounds tore through the police car, shattering the glass and riddling the metal with holes. Detective Harry McGinnis was hit in the chest and killed instantly. The other officers scrambled for cover, returning fire with their service revolvers and shotguns, but they were hopelessly outgunned. A second officer, Constable J.W. Wes Harriman, was struck in the head and neck. He would die from his wounds. In the chaos, the gang made their escape. Blanche, in a panic, ran out into the street, chasing after her small dog, Snowball. Buck and Jones ran after her, firing wildly to provide cover, and bundled her into the car. Clyde laid down a final, furious barrage of automatic fire as they sped away, leaving a scene of carnage and confusion behind them. They had escaped again, but the Joplin shootout was a turning point. They had killed 2 more lawmen in cold blood. The incident made national headlines. The Barrow gang was no longer a regional problem. They were a federal concern. The gloves were off. There would be no more talk of capture, only of elimination. But their most significant mistake was not the gunfight itself, but what they left behind in their haste to flee the apartment. In the abandoned rooms, police found a trove of the gang's personal belongings: Buck's parole papers, a collection of firearms, and a poem written by Bonnie. But the most important discovery was a small, undeveloped roll of film, When the Joplin Globe newspaper developed the photographs, they struck gold. The images were stunning. They showed Bonnie and Clyde and W.D. Jones in various playful, defiant poses. Clyde, looking like a Hollywood gangster, leans against a stolen Ford V8, shotgun in hand. Bonnie, in a beret and tight-fitting sweater, strikes a now iconic pose, foot up on the bumper of the car, pistol in her hand, a cigar clamped between her teeth, though in reality she was a cigarette smoker who disliked cigars. Another photo shows her playfully holding a rifle on Clyde as he feigns surrender. These were not the grainy, unflattering mugshots the public was used to seeing. These were intimate, self-aware, and almost theatrical portraits. They were images that told a story. The newspapers ran the photos nationwide. The Associated Press wire service sent them to every corner of the country. Overnight, Bonnie and Clyde were transformed. They were no longer just names in a crime report. They were celebrities. They had faces, personalities, a style. The public, weary of the depression and hungry for distraction, was captivated. Here was a story of love, rebellion, and glamour, played out against a backdrop of thrilling danger. The photographs created the myth. The image of Bonnie, the cigar-chomping gun moll, was particularly powerful, though it was a complete fabrication of her real persona. She was by all accounts a devoted partner, but not an active shooter in the gang's robberies. The photos, however, created an image of a deadly duo, equal partners in crime, which was far more compelling than the complicated truth. This newfound fame was a double-edged sword. It fed their egos, particularly Bonnie's, who had always craved the spotlight, but it also made them instantly recognizable. Every gas station attendant, every store clerk, every passerby was now a potential informant. There was nowhere left to hide. Their faces were plastered in post offices and on the front pages of newspapers from California to New York. The decision to take those photographs, to document their life on the run, was perhaps the most critical decision they ever made. It was an act of vanity that sealed their fate. It erased any possibility of fading into obscurity, of ever returning to a normal life. They were now trapped inside the legend they had helped create. In the weeks following Joplin, the gang's life became even more frantic. They carameled across the Midwest, from Texas to Minnesota, committing a string of robberies to fund their existence. The close calls became more frequent, the escapes narrower. On June 10, 1933, near Wellington, Texas, Clyde, driving at high speed, missed a sign for a detour and plunged their car into a ravine. The car caught fire. Bonnie was trapped in the passenger seat, and her right leg was horribly burned by battery acid. The burns were so severe that in some places, the muscle was exposed to the bone. She would never walk properly again. For the rest of her life, she either hopped on her good leg or was carried by Clyde. Her injury added another layer of desperation to their flight. They were now fugitives caring for a crippled woman, a burden that slowed them down and made them more vulnerable. The glamour of the Joplin photos was a distant memory, replaced by the stench of antiseptic and the sound of Bonnie's constant, agonizing pain. The noose was tightening. The law was closing in, coordinating their efforts, learning from their mistakes. The Barrow gang's luck, which had seemed inexhaustible, was beginning to run out. Another bloody confrontation was inevitable, one that would tear the gang apart and set the stage for the final desperate act of their deadly drama. Chapter 6. The Platte City Firestorm. By July of 1933, the Barrow gang was wounded and exhausted. Bonnie's leg was a source of constant, excruciating pain, the burns refusing to heal in the unsanitary conditions of life on the road. The five of them, Clyde, Bonnie, Buck, Blanche, and W.D. Jones, were fraying at the edges. The constant fear, the endless driving, and the internal frictions were taking their toll. They needed a place to rest, a place where Bonnie could recuperate. They chose the Red Crown Tourist Court in Platte City, Missouri, a collection of brick cabins that offered a degree of privacy. They checked in on July 18th, renting 2 adjoining cabins. Clyde, paranoid as ever, registered them as a party of 3, paying in cash. But their behavior immediately aroused suspicion. Clyde backed the car into the garage, outlaw style, for a quick getaway. Blanche went into town to buy bandages, food, and supplies, paying for everything with coins, which was unusual. The local pharmacist, alerted by her strange request for medical supplies, contacted the authorities. The Platte County Sheriff, Holt Coffey, was notified. He in turn contacted law enforcement in Kansas City, including the Jackson County Sheriff, Tom Bash. A plan was quickly formulated. The lawmen were not going to repeat the mistakes of Joplin. They knew they were dealing with heavily armed, desperate killers. This time, they would come prepared. They assembled a formidable posse, armed with machine guns, shotguns, and steel-plated shields. In the pre-dawn hours of July 20th, the tourist court was quietly surrounded. An armored car, a repurposed sedan fitted with steel plates, was positioned to block the garage doors. The lawmen took up positions behind trees and in ditches, their weapons trained on the two small brick cabins. Inside, the gang was asleep, unaware of the steel trap closing around them. The raid began just as dawn was breaking. Sheriff Bash knocked on the door of one of the cabins. Blanche, half asleep, answered. Just a minute. Those two words confirmed they had the right people. At that moment, a massive fusillade of gunfire erupted. The lawmen poured hundreds of rounds into the brick cabins, the bullets chewing through the walls, shattering windows and ricocheting through the small rooms. The gang, jolted from sleep, responded with their own ferocious firepower. Clyde and Buck grabbed their Browning automatic rifles and began firing back. The roar of the BARs, a stark contrast to the smaller caliber weapons of the police. The battle raged for nearly half an hour, a chaotic and terrifying exchange of gunfire in the quiet morning. The armored car proved critical, absorbing much of the gang's return fire and preventing their escape through the garage. Trapped and outgunned, Clyde knew they had to break out. He directed their fire toward the unarmored sections of the police line, forcing the officers to take cover. Under this covering fire, he got Bonnie, who was still unable to walk, into the car. Then, in a moment of sheer audacity, he ordered W.D. Jones to ram the car through the garage door. The Ford V8 roared to life and smashed through the wooden doors, bursting out into the open. As they careened out of the driveway, a police bullet struck the car's horn, which began to blare continuously, a chilling soundtrack to their desperate flight. But they were not all safe. Buck and Blanche were caught in the open as they tried to reach the car. A bullet struck Buck in the side of the head, a ghastly wound that exposed his brain. Another volley of shots shattered the car's windows, sending shards of glass flying into Blanche's face, blinding her in both eyes. W.D. Jones, also hit, managed to scramble into the car with Clyde and Bonnie. Buck, horrifically wounded but still conscious, staggered after them, firing his weapon until he collapsed. Clyde, seeing his brother fall, slammed the car to a halt, and under a hail of bullets, he and Jones dragged Buck's limp body into the vehicle. Blanche, screaming and blinded, stumbled toward the car and was pulled inside. They roared off into the darkness, the car's horn still blaring, leaving behind a scene of utter devastation. They had escaped, but the cost was catastrophic. Buck was dying, his head wound was mortal, and there was nothing they could do for him. Blanche was hysterical, her eyes filled with glass, her world plunged into darkness and pain. The gang, as a cohesive unit, was broken. For the next 4 days, they were fugitives in the purest sense, hiding in the woods, trying to tend to Buck's horrific injury. They were covered in blood, their clothes in tatters, with no food and little water. The romantic myth of the outlaw life had been stripped away, revealing the raw, ugly reality beneath. The end came on July 24th, in an abandoned amusement park near Dexfield Park, Iowa. A local farmer spotted their bloody bandages and alerted the authorities. A posse of nearly 100 men, including local police and citizen volunteers, surrounded their campsite. Another gun battle erupted, but this time, the gang was too weak to mount a real defense. Clyde, Bonnie, and W.D. Jones were all wounded again in the exchange. Realizing the situation was hopeless, they made a run for it, abandoning Buck and Blanche. They managed to cross a river and disappear into the woods, but they left everything behind. The posse closed in on the campsite to find a truly pathetic scene. Buck Barrow, barely conscious, lay on the ground, his head wound festering. Blanche, blinded and terrified, was huddled beside him, refusing to leave his side. When the officers approached, Buck, defiant to the last, tried to reach for a gun. He was easily subdued. Blanche was taken into custody, screaming for her husband. Buck Barrow died 5 days later in a hospital, after surgeons attempted to operate on his shattered skull. His last words were reportedly a request to hear his wife's voice. Blanche, after her eyes were treated, was sentenced to 10 years in prison. The breaking point had been reached. The Barrow gang was shattered. Clyde had lost his brother, his hero. Bonnie was a cripple. W.D. Jones, wounded and disillusioned, would soon leave them, eventually being captured and providing a full confession that detailed their crimes. From this point forward, Bonnie and Clyde were alone. They were no longer a gang. They were just two hunted animals, wounded, isolated, and running on pure desperation, with the entire weight of the American justice system bearing down on them. The final act was about to begin. Chapter 7. The Hounds of Texas. In the aftermath of the Dexfield Park shootout, Bonnie and Clyde were ghosts. They vanished into the vastness of the American landscape. Wounded and utterly alone, the bravado was gone, replaced by a grim day-to-day struggle for survival. Bonnie's leg burn left her permanently disabled, and the new wounds from the Iowa gunfight only added to their misery. They were in constant pain, living in their stolen cars, hiding in thickets and remote gullies, their existence reduced to its most primitive elements, finding food, stealing gasoline, and avoiding capture. For months, they drifted, surfacing occasionally to commit small-scale robberies in places as far-flung as Mississippi and Illinois. They were phantoms, but their legend continued to grow. The newspapers, lacking new photographs, recycled the old Joplin pictures, keeping their faces in the public eye. The myth of the romantic rebels persisted, even as the reality for the two fugitives became a living hell of pain, fear, and isolation. Clyde, driven by a need for revenge and perhaps a desire to reclaim his fearsome reputation, began to plan his most audacious act yet. He was going to attack Eastham Prison Farm, the place that had scarred him so deeply, that had transformed him from a petty thief into a killer, was his ultimate target. He aimed to humiliate the Texas prison system and its formidable director, Lee Simmons. It was a deeply personal vendetta. On January 16, 1934, Clyde Barrow put his plan into motion. He had smuggled guns into the prison, planting them near a worksite for the inmate field crews. As the prisoners marched out to work, two of Clyde's old associates, Raymond Hamilton and Joe Palmer, made a break for the weapons. A third prisoner, Henry Methvin, joined them. As they grabbed the guns, Clyde and Bonnie provided covering fire from the edge of the woods with their Browning automatic rifles. In the ensuing chaos, one of the prison guards, Major Joe Crowson, was shot and killed. The breakout was a success. Hamilton, Palmer, and Methvin escaped, and the Barrow gang had new members, but the cost was immense. Clyde had now killed a Texas prison guard, a direct assault on the state's authority. For Lee Simmons and the Texas government, this was the final straw. They had been embarrassed and challenged on their own turf. They decided that the hunt for Bonnie and Clyde could no longer be left to local sheriffs and uncoordinated pauses. They needed a specialist. They needed a hunter. They turned to one man, Captain Frank Hamer. Hamer was a legend in Texas, a man spoken of in the same revered tones as the old gunfighters of the West. He was a former Texas Ranger, though the Rangers had been recently disbanded and reformed under a different structure. He was technically retired, but his reputation was immense. He was tall, imposing, and taciturn, a man who preferred action to words. He was credited with having been in over 50 gunfights and killing more than a dozen men in the line of duty. He was a master tracker, a brilliant detective, and utterly relentless. He was, in short, the perfect man to hunt Clyde Barrow. Lee Simmons personally hired Hamer, giving him a commission as an officer of the Texas Highway Patrol and a simple, chilling mandate: stop Bonnie and Clyde. The method was left to Hamer's discretion. It was understood by all that this was not a mission of capture. It was a mission of extermination. Hamer approached the task with the cold, methodical patience that had defined his career. He did not chase sightings or follow hot tips. He began by studying his quarry. He mapped out their entire criminal career, every robbery, every murder, every known location. He drove thousands of miles, visiting the scenes of their crimes, talking to witnesses, and interviewing other lawmen. He quickly identified their single greatest weakness, the flaw in Clyde's otherwise cautious planning: family. Hamer observed what he called the circle theory. He noticed that no matter how far the gang roamed, they always circled back to Dallas to see the Barrow family, and to Louisiana near the home of their newest member, Henry Methvin. Their need for family contact was a predictable, repeating pattern. Hamer decided he would not chase them. He would wait for them. He would predict where they were going and set a trap. While Hamer was methodically closing his net, the newly reconstituted Barrow gang was on its final bloody rampage. The addition of Raymond Hamilton and Henry Methvin made the group even more volatile. Hamilton was a hardened criminal with his own ego, and he frequently clashed with Clyde over leadership and the division of money. The tension culminated in a bitter split. But before that, the gang committed one of their most senseless and tragic murders. On Easter Sunday, April 1st, 1934, near Grapevine, Texas, they were parked on the side of the road when two young highway patrolmen, E.B. Wheeler and H.D. Murphy, pulled over to investigate what they thought was a stranded motorist. Before the officers could even get out of their car, Clyde and Henry Methvin opened fire with shotguns and automatic rifles, killing both men instantly. Murphy was on his second day on the job and was due to be married the following week. The Grapevine murders caused a public outcry. Any lingering romanticism about Bonnie and Clyde evaporated, replaced by revulsion. The newspapers, which had once painted them as folk heroes, now labeled them human rats. The public tide had turned definitively against them. Bonnie Parker, who had likely not fired a shot, was vilified in the press as a cold-blooded killer. An eyewitness claimed to have seen a red-headed woman fire into the head of one of the downed officers, a story that was almost certainly false, but which cemented her image as a monster in the public consciousness. Just 5 days later, near Commerce, Oklahoma, the gang killed again. They shot and killed Constable Cal Campbell and kidnapped the town's police chief. The pace of the violence was escalating, becoming more reckless, more desperate. Frank Hamer now had all the information he needed. He knew the gang was unraveling. He knew they were being drawn inexorably back toward the homes of their families, and he had found his key. He had learned that Henry Methvin, the newest and weakest link in the chain, was desperate to save his own skin. Hamer and his team made contact with Methvin's father, Ivan. A deal was struck. In exchange for a full pardon for his son in Texas, Ivan Methvin would betray Bonnie and Clyde. He would tell Hamer where and when they would be. The trap was about to be set. Ivan Methvin told Hamer that the couple was planning to visit his home in Louisiana in the coming days. He agreed to cooperate, to be the lure. The stage was now set for the final confrontation, not in a blaze of glory in some city shootout, but on a lonely, forgotten road in the backwoods of Bienville Parish, Louisiana. The hounds of Texas had found their scent. Chapter 8. 157 bullets. The trap was meticulously planned. Frank Hamer chose the location himself, a stretch of Louisiana State Highway 154, about 8 miles south of the town of Gibbsland. It was a narrow road, flanked by a high, wooded embankment on one side and a steep drop-off on the other. It was a natural bottleneck, a perfect kill zone. The posse, handpicked by Hamer, consisted of 6 men. From Texas, there was Hamer himself and his old ranger colleague Maney Goat. From Dallas County, there were deputies Bob Alcorn and Ted Hinton. And from Bienville Parish, Louisiana, there was Sheriff Henderson Jordan and his deputy, Prentice Oakley. They were armed for a small war, with a collection of Browning automatic rifles, shotguns, and revolvers. Prentice Oakley, the youngest of the group, brought a Remington Model 8 semi-automatic rifle, a powerful weapon he had borrowed specifically for this occasion. The plan relied on the betrayal of Ivan Methvin. He was instructed to park his truck on the side of the road, with one wheel removed, to feign a breakdown. The posse knew that Clyde Barrow, despite his ruthlessness, would not abandon a comrade. He would stop to help. That would be the fatal moment. On the night of May 22nd, the 6 lawmen took their positions, hiding themselves in the thick brush on the embankment overlooking the road. They endured a night of mosquitoes and nervous anticipation. As dawn broke on May 23rd, the humid Louisiana air was thick with tension. They waited. Around 9 o'clock in the morning, Ivan Methvin arrived and positioned his truck as planned. He then discreetly removed himself from the immediate area, leaving the disabled truck as bait. The lawmen settled in for the final wait. Shortly after, at approximately 9:15 a.m., they heard the sound they had been waiting for: the high-pitched whine of a Ford VV8 approaching at speed. The car, a tan-colored sedan, came into view, just as predicted. Clyde was behind the wheel, driving in his stocking feet, as he often did for better control of the pedals. Bonnie was beside him, a half-eaten sandwich in her lap. As the Ford drew near the disabled truck, Clyde slowed the vehicle. He recognized Ivan Methvin's truck and pulled over to offer assistance. The car rolled to a near stop directly in front of the posse's concealed position. In that instant, Frank Hamer stood up and, according to some accounts, yelled, "Halt," though others in the posse would later say no warning was given. It didn't matter. Before Clyde could react, before he could reach for the arsenal of weapons at his feet, Prentice Oakley opened fire with his semi-automatic rifle. The first 2 shots struck Clyde in the head, killing him instantly. The car, no longer under his control, began to roll slowly forward. What followed was not a gunfight. It was an annihilation. The other 5 lawmen rose from the brush and unleashed a deafening torrent of fire. They emptied their weapons into the car, reloaded, and fired again. The sound was like a prolonged thunderclap, echoing through the piney woods. Bullets from the BARs punched through the car's steel body, as if it were paper. The safety glass of the windows disintegrated into a million tiny cubes. Ted Hinton, who knew Bonnie, described hearing a scream from inside the car after the initial volley, a scream that was abruptly cut short as the fusillade continued. The posse fired for what felt like an eternity, pouring an estimated 157 rounds into the vehicle. They took no chances. They continued firing long after any sign of life had ceased, their adrenaline and pent-up fury driving them to make absolutely certain that the reign of Bonnie and Clyde was over. Finally, Hamer gave the order to cease fire. An eerie silence descended, broken only by the smell of cordite and the slow hiss of steam from the car's punctured radiator. The lawman cautiously approached the vehicle. The scene inside was gruesome beyond description. The car was a sieve, riddled with so many holes that, according to one witness, daylight shone through it. Clyde Barrow was slumped over the steering wheel, his body torn apart by the gunfire. Bonnie Parker was slumped against him, almost as if in a final macabre embrace. The coroner's report would later state that Clyde had been hit at least 17 times, Bonnie at least 26. The true number was likely higher, as some entrance and exit wounds overlapped. The car itself was an arsenal on wheels. Inside, the posse found 3 Browning automatic rifles, a dozen handguns, a shotgun, and thousands of rounds of ammunition. They also found saxophones, license plates from multiple states, and a copy of Bonnie's latest poem, The Story of Bonnie and Clyde, which prophetically described their own violent end. Word of the ambush spread like wildfire. Within minutes, a crowd began to gather. People came from Gippsland and the surrounding farms, drawn by the sound of the gunfire and the news that the famous outlaws were dead. The scene quickly devolved into a grotesque circus. Souvenir hunters swarmed the car, attempting to clip locks of Bonnie's hair, tear pieces from her bloody dress, and even, according to some reports, tried to cut off Clyde's trigger finger. The lawmen had to fight to control the mob. The death car, with the bodies still inside, was towed to the Conger furniture store and funeral parlor in nearby Arcadia. The town's population swelled as thousands of people descended, hoping to catch a glimpse of the dead outlaws. The bodies were put on public display, a grim testament to the end of their violent journey. The posse members became instant heroes. Frank Hamer, true to his nature, shunned the spotlight, simply stating that he had completed his job. The immediate aftermath was one of relief for law enforcement across the country. The 2-year crime wave that had claimed the lives of at least 9 police officers and several civilians was finally over. But for the families of Bonnie and Clyde, the ordeal was just beginning. They had to claim the bodies of their children and bring them home to Dallas for burial. The public's fascination, however, did not die with them. It was merely transformed. The bloody, brutal reality of their end would soon be sanded down by time and myth, leaving behind a story that was far more romantic and far less truthful than the one that ended in a storm of bullets on a lonely Louisiana road. Chapter 9. The Ghoulish Spectacle. The deaths of Bonnie and Clyde did not bring a quiet end to their story. Instead, their demise ignited a national spectacle, a bizarre and morbid fascination that revealed much about the state of America in the 1930s. The news of the ambush in Louisiana became a media sensation, with newspapers across the country splashing the graphic details across their front pages. The public, which had followed their exploits with a mixture of fear and admiration, now clamored for the final, grisly chapter. The journey back to Dallas was a surreal procession. The bodies were prepared for burial in separate funeral homes, but the public's desire to see the infamous couple was insatiable. In Dallas, thousands of people lined the streets, hoping to catch a glimpse of the hearses. The funeral homes were mobbed. An estimated 10,000 people swarmed the funeral home where Clyde's body lay, pressing against the windows, desperate for a look. The scene was even more chaotic for Bonnie's funeral. Over 20,000 people descended upon the small chapel, trampling the lawn, climbing on cars, and crushing floral arrangements sent by admirers, including one reputedly from the notorious outlaw Pretty Boy Floyd. The funerals themselves were a study in contrast. Bonnie had always wished to be buried next to Clyde. Her last poem, The Story of Bonnie and Clyde, ended with the lines, "Someday they'll go down together, and they'll bury them side by side. To a few it'll be grief, to the law relief, but it's death for Bonnie and Clyde." Her mother, Emma Parker, refused this final wish. She could never forgive Clyde for the path he had led her daughter down. She had her buried in the Fishtrap Cemetery in West Dallas, far from where Clyde would be laid to rest. Clyde was buried in Western Heights Cemetery, next to his brother Buck. Their separate graves were a final poignant testament to the families torn apart by their violent lives. The long-term effects of their crime spree rippled outwards, changing the landscape of American law enforcement. The Barrow Gang's ability to operate with impunity across state lines highlighted a critical weakness in the nation's policing structure. Local and state agencies were often isolated, unable to communicate effectively or pursue criminals beyond their jurisdictional boundaries. The rise of celebrity outlaws like Bonnie and Clyde, John Dillinger, and others provided a powerful argument for the creation of a stronger national police force. J. Edgar Hoover, the ambitious director of the Bureau of Investigation, soon to be renamed the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or FBI, used these high-profile cases to dramatically expand his agency's power and influence. The National Firearms Act of 1934, passed just weeks after the ambush, was a direct response to the gang's use of military-grade weapons like the Browning automatic rifle. The law heavily taxed and regulated the sale and ownership of machine guns and sawed-off shotguns, the preferred tools of the public enemies. The era of the heavily armed, highly mobile outlaw gang was coming to an end, crushed by a more organized and federally empowered system of justice. The members of the posse who had carried out the ambush were hailed as heroes, but their lives were forever marked by the event. They were awarded the promised reward money, though it was less than they had expected. Frank Hamer returned to a quieter life, his reputation as a legendary lawman cemented. Ted Hinton would later write a book about his experiences, forever haunted by the memory of the pretty waitress he had helped to kill. Prentice Oakley, the man who fired the first shots, was said to have been deeply affected by the violence of that morning. For the surviving family members, the consequences were long-lasting. Blanche Barrow served her prison sentence, and upon her release, lived a quiet, respectable life, forever trying to escape the shadow of her past. Jones, the gang's young accomplice, also served time and provided invaluable testimony that helped to demystify the gang's inner workings, stripping away the glamour to reveal the fear and desperation at its core. The families of Bonnie and Clyde, the Parkers and the Barrows, were left to live with the shame and the grief, forever linked to the infamous deeds of their children. But the most enduring consequence was the creation of the myth. The brutal reality of their lives, the poverty, the squalor, the constant fear, the cold-blooded murders began to fade from public memory almost immediately. What remained was the powerful, romanticized image captured in those Joplin photographs, the defiant rebels, the star-crossed lovers on the run from a cruel and unjust world. This narrative was far more appealing than the truth. It resonated with a public that felt betrayed by the institutions of power during the Great Depression. In Bonnie and Clyde, many saw a reflection of their own frustrations, a vicarious thrill in seeing someone strike back against the banks and the government. The story became a modern American folktale, passed down and reshaped by books, songs, and most powerfully, by film. The 1967 movie Bonnie and Clyde, starring Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway, would cement their status as counterculture icons for a new generation, glamorizing their violence and romanticizing their relationship. The film's stylish depiction of rebellion resonated with the anti-establishment mood of the 1960s, ensuring that the myth would overshadow the reality for decades to come. The bullet-riddled Ford VW-8, the death car, became a celebrity in its own right. It was towed around the country and displayed at carnivals and fairs for decades, a ghoulish relic that people would pay a quarter to see. The car, more than any book or film, served as the most tangible link to the violent truth of their end, a truth that was increasingly being forgotten in favor of a more palatable, and ultimately false, legend. Chapter 10. The Ballad and the Bullet. In the end, two stories of Bonnie and Clyde remain. There is the ballad and there is the bullet. The ballad is the myth. It is the story of star-crossed lovers, of glamorous rebels fighting a losing battle against a faceless system. It's a tale of adventure and loyalty, of a ride-or-die romance played out on the open roads of America. It is the story told in the Joplin photographs, in the Hollywood films, and in the popular imagination. It is a story that speaks to a deep-seated desire for freedom, for rebellion, for a life lived without compromise. This is the story of the icons, the legends whose names have become synonymous with a certain kind of dangerous romantic allure. It is a powerful and enduring narrative, one that has captivated audiences for nearly a century. Then there is the story of the bullet. This is the reality. It is the story of two damaged children from the slums of West Dallas, born into a world that offered them no hope and no future. It is the story of Clyde Barrow, a man hardened and brutalized by a horrific prison system, who killed out of a cold mixture of revenge and self-preservation. It is the story of Bonnie Parker, a bright but naive young woman who hitched her dreams to a violent man, a decision that led her down a path of unimaginable pain and terror. The story of the bullet is not about glamour. It is about the stench of cordite, the taste of fear, and the constant grinding misery of life on the run. It is about sleeping in filth, about the agony of untreated wounds, about the cold-blooded murder of men whose only crime was wearing a uniform. It is the story of the 9 law enforcement officers, and at least 4 civilians who lost their lives at the hands of the Barrow gang. It is the story of families destroyed, not just the families of the victims, but the Parkers and the Barrows themselves, who watched in horror as their children became monsters in the public eye. The true legacy of Bonnie and Clyde is not found in their supposed rebellion against the state. They were not Robin Hoods. They robbed individuals, gas stations, and small-town banks, not the powerful financial institutions that had caused the Depression. They did not share their meager loot with the poor. They used it to buy weapons, food, and gasoline to continue their flight. Their rebellion was a selfish one, a nihilistic rampage born of personal grievance and a profound lack of empathy. Their significance lies not in what they did, but in what they represented to the public at that specific moment in American history. They became a canvas onto which a disillusioned nation could project its own anger and fantasies. Their story resonated because it was a human story, albeit a dark and twisted one. It was a story of ambition, however misguided, of loyalty, however destructive, and of a desperate clawing attempt to be somebody in a world that had labeled them as nobodies. Bonnie Parker, the poet, seemed to understand this better than anyone. Her final poem, The Story of Bonnie and Clyde, is not a celebration of their life, but clear-eyed, fatalistic acceptance of their inevitable end. She knew they were not heroes. She knew their path led only to the grave. She wrote, from heartbreak and strife, they entered the life of crime. But it's death for Bonnie and Clyde. Today their grave sites in Dallas still attract visitors. People leave flowers, coins, and even bullets as tributes. The death car, now housed in a casino in Nevada, remains a popular tourist attraction, its perforated steel, a silent witness to the violence of their final moments. The story endures because it is a uniquely American tragedy. It is a story about the intersection of poverty, violence, media, and celebrity. It is a cautionary tale about the seductive power of myth, and the ease with which we can forget the bloody reality that lies beneath. The ballad is easy to remember. It is romantic, exciting, and simple. The story of the bullet is harder to confront. It is ugly, brutal, and complex. But it is in that difficult, violent truth that the real story of Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow is found. Not as folk heroes, but as two lost souls in a troubled time, whose deadly romance was not a grand adventure, but a short, desperate, and ultimately meaningless ride to oblivion.